Hi, I'm Stuart Malina, Music Director of the Greenwich Symphony Orchestra. Today I'm here to talk about the concert we'll be presenting on January 27th and 28th at the Performing Arts Center at Greenwich High School. The Greenwich Symphony Orchestra will be playing three very different pieces of music. The first is a short work by American composer Charles Ives, which was written in 1906. It's one of his most famous and arguably one of his most important pieces, a short work called The Unanswered Question. Now, Charles Ives is famous in American music history for a couple of things. First, during his lifetime, he was relatively unknown. Only very late in his life was his music discovered and started being performed. He had a career as an actuary, but he was busy composing all of this time. He wrote many, many songs, symphonies, orchestral works, chamber works. The Unanswered Question, he actually gives a description of what this piece is supposed to be. He talks about three different groups that are performing in this intimate piece. It was originally written for 4 flutes, 1 trumpet, and a string quartet. But in his notes, he says that the woodwinds, the 4 flutes, can be played by 2 flutes, a clarinet, and an oboe, which is what we will be doing, or in fact, any combination of treble wind instruments in a group of any size. He also says that the strings can be a larger section, ranging from just the string quartet to a simple addition of a double bass to a full string section, as we will be performing it. And in his description, he talks about what each group is in his mind. The strings represent what he calls the silence of the Druids, who know, see, and hear nothing. The woodwind quartet is answering a question posed musically by the trumpet, and he calls this the perennial question of existence. And the quartet is hunting for what he calls the invisible answer. As the piece progresses, it becomes clear that the quartet is beginning to argue. It becomes a little bit more intense, a little bit faster, a little bit louder, until it becomes furious and crazed towards the end of the piece. The trumpet is simply posing the same question time after time, and the strings are presenting kind of a blanket of chordal movement. So the strings, just to give you a sense of what this will sound like, the strings are completely tonal, playing major and minor chords in kind of this timeless chorale, where the time is going so slowly that you can barely even sense any kind of a motor to it. This is a little bit of what it will sound like. And so on. So this is happening at a dynamic that is barely a hush. And it stays at that dynamic, that level of volume, for the entirety of the piece. So on top of this very tonal background, the trumpet poses the question, the perennial question of existence. And this is an atonal question, meaning that it doesn't have any bearing on chords. Here is what the question sounds like. It's a ambiguous question. It's a question that feels so out of place given the background that it commands an answer. And the answers come in the quartet. And the quartet also is playing atonally, very much in an early 20th century style. Atonal music was beginning to come into vogue at this period. And, it begins very simply and very softly. And as I said earlier, each time it becomes more and more intense. Later on, towards the middle to the end of the piece, it also becomes clear that the woodwinds are mocking the question. It becomes a derision of the trumpet's question, and they'll start quoting the question in their answer as it becomes more and more frenetic. The final answer, or the final attempt at an answer that the quartet gives, is an enormous crazed argument, literally screaming at the audience. And then it ends. And we're left with simply the question, and even that then disappears, and we're left with just this pure tonality, a G major chord at the end. And we're left with the sense of incredible peace and solace almost. The way I look at this piece, and I think I mentioned this in my program notes, there are certain things to which there are no answers. And Bernstein did an entire set of lectures saying that the ultimate question was, whither music? Why is there music? But I think of it a little bit more in a general, universal sense, that you have these questions that cannot be answered, and there are arguments floating all around us. And these arguments can become so incredibly loud, noisy, and take over our psyches. And so it is incumbent on us to filter out the noise and be left with the quiet that exists underneath the surface. I think it's a spectacular piece. The whole thing is fairly short, but it's a piece that really makes the audience think. And I think in the end, it is particularly apt for our times today when there is so much noise happening all around us on social media, in the news, in the world. Everyone is arguing, and there is hopefully some kind of universal calm underneath that din. The second piece on our program is one of the great violin concertos of all time. Some have actually said it is, in fact, the greatest violin concerto of all time, and that is the violin concerto of Ludwig van Beethoven. Now, Beethoven was at this point in his middle period. Early on in his career, he was writing music very much in the classical style. Then he had his middle period where things start expanding and he starts looking towards the future. And then finally the late style where things get a little bit wacky. He's going into new directions, and he's lost his hearing. And you can hear this in the music, this attempt at finding new musical horizons. But this piece falls smack in the middle in 1806, in fact, 100 years almost exactly before the unanswered question. And it's a piece of unbelievable serenity. It's one of the great works of late classical, early romantic music. Beethoven was at the top of his game. So what's new about this piece? Well, if you look at the concertos that had been written before the Beethoven Violin Concerto, none of them has the scope of this piece. To begin with, it's a much bigger piece in terms of length than the Mozart concertos, say, that came before him. It also features the violin in a much more virtuosic way. We're heading into the age of the virtuosos, the people like Paganini and Liszt, who would travel the world and show off just how great they were at their instruments, doing crazy technical things. Now, this does not have the technical demands of, say, a Brahms violin concerto or a Sibelius violin concerto that would come much later. But already he's setting the groundwork for a piece of music that has much, much greater demands on the soloist than anything that came earlier. But the other things that you find in this piece are the typical characteristics of Beethoven's music. For example, the sudden shifts in feeling, where things will be serene and quiet and then suddenly interrupted by something extremely strong and almost staggering. Immediately at the beginning of this piece, he sets it up in a way that is fairly unprecedented. Now, in most music that came before this, in the concerto style, you would have an orchestra tutti that begins the piece, that lays out all of the themes, and this piece is no exception to that. But what's interesting about this piece is it begins with a rhythmic motive in just the timpani, playing 4 quarter notes. And then a beautiful serene. And then the timpani again. And then the serene theme. And so you have not only melodic motives set at the beginning, but also a very clear rhythmic motive. Now, this is not unheard of in Beethoven's music. You have where, again, there's a melodic component and there's also a rhythmic component, which will basically set up that entire powerful first movement. In this case, this that you hear in the timpani becomes a motive unto itself, and the strings immediately take it up. I'm not going to play all of the themes from this wonderful concerto, but this opening is so distinctive and sets up this first movement so incredibly beautifully. It just was worth mentioning. The other thing is the way he develops motives. Now, we talked a little bit about the rhythmic motive, but shortly after this opening section, you get a setup of scales. And he will take that and he will develop that into other motives. For example, the second theme of this first movement also begins with a scale. And you also hear how he's using that opening rhythmic motive as kind of a counterpoint to this lyrical theme. So again, this is typical Beethoven. Beethoven was kind of the king of transformation of material. He would take the tiniest bit of material, like a 4-note rhythmic motive or a scale, and turn it into something spectacular and beautiful. The first movement is extremely lengthy. As I said, it's longer than any previous concerto movement for violin that I can think of. It also will feature a substantial cadenza. The cadenzas also begin taking on a greater form. And, well, the history of this piece is interesting. It was written for a violinist named Clement, who apparently did a rather shabby job of the premiere, and the piece kind of then disappeared for a while. Only several decades later did a violinist named Joseph Joachim rediscover this piece, write a spectacular cadenza for it, and brought it back to life under the baton, interestingly, of Felix Mendelssohn. And then suddenly it became like the big thing, and through the present, one of the most beloved violin concertos. But you'll hear this cadenza in the first movement. So the second movement also is a little bit different from what you would have had before. In a Mozart violin concerto, the second movement will tend to be a lyrical arioso kind of melody. This one begins with an orchestra introduction that sets out a simple theme, and it will become somewhat of a theme and variations. This is what that theme sounds like. And we're going to hear this theme several times. Each time it returns with a slightly different twist. Sometimes a twist in orchestration, sometimes there will be an obligato violin part that goes with it, sometimes it will be extremely strong. Interspersed with these variations is another theme, another one of these beautiful lyrical Beethoven themes, with a hushed accompaniment and a simple melody in the violin. Let's see. And so on and so forth. It's a rather short second movement, certainly compared to either of the outer movements, and particularly coming off of the first movement. But it's just so wonderful in its contrast to the first movement, which is rather strong, bombastic, lyrical, spectacular in many ways. And this is like totally intimate, like pulling us within his soul, rather than outwardly shouting out to the audience. The last movement is an enormous contrast to the serenity of the second movement. It is a joyful, dance-like rondo. If you think of the word rondo as being of the same derivation as the word round, you have a theme that starts at point A on your circle, and then you go into a new theme, and that will take you around, and eventually you'll circle back to the original theme, and this can happen many, many different times. And so if you think about it in letters, it's an A theme followed by a B theme, then an A theme followed by a C theme, then an A theme followed by a D theme. This is an incredible rondo, and the dance melody is one that's deeply infectious and immediately captures the spirit of this final movement. It begins as just a duet between the violin and the cello. After this intimate presentation of the theme, it explodes into a full orchestra presentation of the same theme, and this sets us off into this wonderful, wonderful rondo. Again, more virtuosic than what came before it. The scope is greater. The use of the orchestra is much more powerful. Beethoven was the king of getting an orchestra to sound majestic and huge. This is clearly one of the great works of art of the early 19th century. And in fact, like so much of Beethoven's music, it transformed the form itself. The way I like to think about the classical period is Haydn created these forms, Mozart just did them beautifully, and then Beethoven transformed them into something much bigger. So the symphonies became bigger, the concertos became bigger, the piano trios, the piano sonatas, and I could go on and on and on to talk about Beethoven's contribution. But the other thing that you have to keep in mind about these pieces is that when you get to the later part of the 19th century and into the 20th century, after the piece had been rediscovered and made tremendously famous by Joachim, any composer that was going to write a concerto for violin had to come to grips with this piece. In the same way that anyone that wrote a symphony in the 19th century had to come to grips with the Ninth Symphony of Beethoven. It just had that much of an impact on the direction of music. And so it's just such a great pleasure to present music like this. We have Maya Buchanan, a young phenom, performing the violin part. It should be a magnificent performance of this magnificent piece. The final piece on our program is by Dmitri Shostakovich. I think it's, well, I feel pretty strongly, and I think it's an arguable point, that Shostakovich was the greatest symphonist of the 20th century. He wrote 15 symphonies. A lot of other composers no longer wrote symphonies. They wrote other kinds of orchestral music, whether it be tone poems or ballets or other works for large orchestra. Shostakovich felt very much in that world of symphony writing, and it felt comfortable for him. One of the things that I feel about Shostakovich's symphonies is that context really does make an enormous difference in one's appreciation of what these symphonies are all about. Whereas you can listen to the Beethoven Violin Concerto without knowing a thing about it, and fully appreciate everything that it brings to bear. With Shostakovich, you can certainly enjoy the symphonies on their own. They're wonderful pieces, incredibly powerful, entertaining, sometimes funny, sometimes tragic. But if you understand the context of what was going on in his life when he wrote these pieces, it really does bring a new comprehension of the meaning of these pieces, and thus I do think the appreciation of the piece becomes extremely much more. For example, just to give you an example, not the first symphony that we're performing, but the Fifth Symphony is best understood knowing that just previous to this, he had been denounced by the Soviet government. And this was a very serious thing. Sometimes you actually lost your life after being denounced. Certainly, his livelihood was threatened. And he wrote the Fifth Symphony almost as an apology to the Russian government for having written this music before that they hated. The 10th Symphony was a celebration. The Festive Overture was a celebration of the death of Stalin. The 11th Symphony dealt with the invasion of Hungary. All of these things are important to understand if you're going to fully appreciate the symphonies that were written. The First Symphony is one of the great accomplishments of a young composer of all time. It was written when Shostakovich was 19 years old. It was premiered when he was 19. He started writing it when he was 18. And he was a conservatory student at the Petrograd Conservatory in Russia. And already we see an incredibly mature composer. So what was going on in his life? Well, he had experienced so much in his life already, emotionally, by the time that he was 18 and 19, that it allows him to write this powerful, incredible symphony as his first symphony. When he was 11 years old, in 1917, you had the Bolshevik Revolution, and this turned life upside down in Russia. Certainly it affected every single person who lived there, and this 11-year-old boy experienced things that most 11-year-olds do not. This was followed by periods of terrible starvation and famine, weeks where rations would be cut dramatically and people would have nothing to eat. Just a few years before he wrote this piece, he lost his father. And you can hear those kinds of powerful emotions emerge in the third and fourth movements of this symphony. But what's equally interesting about this symphony is it starts out almost as a funny piece. And as the piece progresses, the first two movements kind of have this boyish charm, this pointed, ironic wit that comes through. And then in the third movement, things change and the piece becomes extremely dramatic, extremely heartfelt, extremely tragic, incredibly sad, and very powerful. Now, you can hear a short lecture by Leonard Bernstein talking about this piece, and what he talks about is that when Shostakovich begins the third movement, he's not striving to be sad and passionate and powerful, but rather it's almost a takeoff on the music of Wagner that came before him and the music of Mahler that was being written around the same time, a little bit before. I'm not sure that I buy into that. I do think that it's an honest expression of his feeling, and he's using that romantic, post-romantic vocabulary of Wagner and Mahler to express these things. But there is definitely a sense of shift. You get to the third movement and things are suddenly very, very different. But we'll get there in a second. I do want to talk a little bit about the first couple of movements. As I say, they're almost funny. The very beginning of the piece begins with a duet between the trumpet and the bassoon, and this is what it sounds like. It's very weird. But then again, this piece is kind of weird, and Shostakovich's music at this point in his life is weird. There are constant shifts, constant surprises. Just when you feel you're settled in a place, it's going to shift and do something differently. And this introduction to the first movement is very much like that. It's in little spurts, little things that happen here, then it happens there, and then it happens there, before we even get our main theme. But we are given melodic material in this beginning that I think is very important. And mostly it comes in the bassoon part. Listen to the bassoon part. So two things that you're getting here. Of course, you're getting rhythmic motives, but that's not what I'm talking about. You have chromatic movement. And the chromatic movement is going to be part of this piece throughout. There will be main themes that are entirely based on that chromatic scale. And there will also be harmonic movement that will be based on that scale. Things like where the chords will move chromatically, creating this weird eeriness in terms of the harmony of the music. The other motive that you hear comes after that chromatic movement. Begins here. That's going to be a melodic motive that you'll get lots of different variations on, beginning with the main theme of the first movement, which sounds like this, and you hear it for the first time in the clarinet. It comes almost directly out of that bassoon part. Of course, it's much more expanded. Again, it has this little pointed kind of wry humor to it. Now, the first movement kind of lives in that land for a while of pointed, dotted rhythm. Ba-dum, 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 ba-dum. It's almost quasi-military, but it's not really military. It's more like poking fun at military music. There is a second theme, which is completely contrasting to the first, and it's a waltz, and you hear it in the flute. But what's interesting about the setting of this waltz is that it's a waltz without a downbeat. Now, I talked about this a little bit last year in Tchaikovsky's Fifth Symphony. That beautiful waltz that comes in the third movement also has no downbeat to start. And so on. And this is like that. And so I don't know whether he's quoting Tchaikovsky. I know that Shostakovich was well versed in Tchaikovsky and admired Tchaikovsky's music intensely. And so it wouldn't be surprising to me if that was what was in his head when he wrote this. So it sounds like this. Again, the downbeats are empty. So it's 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. And so forth and so on. So you're handed these two beautiful themes. What's interesting form-wise about this piece is, yes, you do have a first and a second theme, but there really is no development in this movement or pretty much in any of the movements. Normally in a sonata form, you would have a first theme, a second theme, a closing theme. That would end the exposition. Then you'd have a development where he plays around and moves around in a lot of different ways. Here you have this opening section. Then you have kind of a middle section, which is very quiet, with solo string playing, which reflects back on the introduction of the piece, but not really on the first or second themes so much. And then it all comes together in a closing section after that. And in this closing section, he does something where, I can't really think of any other piece where this is done, where he basically takes the first theme and the second theme and puts them together. So you have both the clarinet theme, and so forth. And then you also, on top of that, have the flute theme. But now he's doing it as a strong, even metered melody. So what it would have been before is, and now it's, and he puts those two together. It's an interesting compositional technique, and he does it in every single movement in this piece. He takes the first theme and the second theme and superimposes one on top of the other, sometimes transformed like here, and sometimes not. So in the second movement, it's another rather compact movement. The first two movements are fairly short in this symphony. And it begins with a crazed energy in the basses and in the cellos. And then the clarinet takes us into a world of intense and very fast melody. That was pretty pathetic, but it doesn't matter. We get eventually to the main theme, and the main theme is presented first in the strings. Again, it's got a lot of energy. It's a delightful theme. It sounds youthful. It fits in that it's by a 19-year-old writing something very exciting and very captivating. But here too, you get elements from the opening, particularly that chromatic scale that we had at the beginning. So this movement goes on. One of the interesting things that you'll hear in this movement is its use of the piano. Now, pianos can be found in orchestras before this, but not really with the sense of soloistic writing that this one does. There are times when the piano, it almost sounds like it's a piano concerto suddenly, where you'll hear the piano playing. And things like that. There's a second theme to this one too, and much like the first movement, where the first theme is fast, the second one is slow, it's the same thing here. The second theme is set over an ostinato of 16th notes in the second violins. And it just continues. And on top of this, we get a theme in the flutes, but two flutes together. Sorry, let's try that again. What's interesting about this theme is that it's in 3/4 time. So it's 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. And that 3/4 time is being marked by a triangle on every downbeat. But the theme itself is actually a 4/4 theme. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3. And so you have this tension between the theme, which is in 4, and the meter, which is being set by percussion underneath it. This will come back later on, as in fact happens in every movement. He sets the first theme and the second theme together. So you have the upper strings and the upper woodwinds playing. And you have the brasses playing the second theme, now in fortissimo, in 4. Again, very, very interesting that he does this in every movement so successfully. So in the third movement, as I said, things take a major shift. And from this very lighthearted, wry, pointed, ironic, humorous approach to writing music, yes, of course, with moments of lyricism and moments of power, but the overall feeling is one of excitement and joy and intensity and humor. The third movement begins with pathos, with an extremely long lyrical melody in the oboe. And I'll just play a little bit of it for you. extremely beautiful, extremely strange, particularly in the way the harmony underneath progresses underneath this lyrical melody. It includes things like what I talked about, where harmonies will move chromatically. But this general sense of sadness, and of slight strangeness pervades the opening of this movement. This oboe theme will be answered by a theme in the cello, and this is what that sounds like. So what's interesting about this is it's so clearly motivated by a desire to quote Wagner. The Tristan and Isolde prelude begins extremely famously, and you have the contour of that in this cello. And then again. So, this will continue to grow, and soon underneath the surface of this lyrical melody comes kind of a fanfare in the trumpets. And this will continue dramatically interrupting the melody until it becomes the main theme for a moment, and brings us towards the second theme of this movement. Some people have called this kind of a fate theme. I certainly will buy into that. Perhaps this is the power of fate. My teacher talked about this movement as being reflective of his grief at the loss of his father. It really doesn't matter. What is important is that you have this 19-year-old young man who has lived through so much sadness, so much intensity, so much upheaval, and this is an expression of his experience through music at this incredibly young age. So the second theme is first presented extremely quietly by the oboe. It's a very somber theme. Well, I'll just play it for you. We'll hear it again later, even quieter, by a solo muted trumpet. And that will be the moment, in fact, when we hear that superimposed over the opening theme. So we have the oboe's melody now and the trumpet in the same register, while the basses and celli are playing the opening oboe solo in the lowest register. The third movement comes to an extremely quiet close with this fate theme being played by solo strings, almost in a chamber music setting. Things are very quiet. We end with a D-flat major chord, and under the surface, a snare drum begins a roll. And the roll builds and builds and builds till it becomes terrifyingly large, and it explodes into the last movement. And I'm not going to talk too much about the last movement. It really works so beautifully on its own. But here, too, you have such a wide range of expression in this final movement. There's a dramatic introduction. This is led into almost a frenetic main theme based on the the chromatic scale from the opening. And that becomes, most of this opening section is just this craziness of things moving so fast. And then all of this will end in an explosive, majestic moment where the brasses will come in, and we're led into a second theme, which has the same kind of pathos and expression as the third movement did. And it begins again with a solo, this time for the violin. Again, with strange harmonies under the surface, but this extremely warm, introverted, sad melody that comes out. And this becomes a very extended section of lyrical music. It will then return to the opening craziness. We have several more explosions. And then the moment that I would like to talk just a little bit about before we start is everything will come, before we stop, everything will come to a crashing close, leaving emptiness, and then all we hear is a solo timpani playing this. Get that 3 times, each time a little bit softer than the previous. So what is this? Well, it is, remember in the third movement, that fate motive. This is that same motive turned upside down. And it's not so much the fact that it's the same motive turned upside down that's so interesting, but that it is a solo timpani doing this with nothing else happening. This will then go back into our intimate lyrical theme, and eventually we will hear both themes together very, very briefly in this movement. But you'll hear in the trombones, the chromatic melody, and you'll hear in the upper woodwinds and strings our lyrical melody from the cello that's now full orchestra playing full strength. The piece comes to a crashing closing, very much like a lot of Shostakovich's symphonies. He knew exactly how to end a piece, and he does it very effectively in this particular work. I think this is one of the more extraordinary symphonies of the 20th century, made all the more extraordinary by the fact that it was written by someone so young. He will go on to write unbelievable symphonies. I mean, certainly in terms of my own personal favorites, I think that the First Symphony, the Fifth Symphony, the Sixth Symphony, the Seventh, that Leningrad Symphony, the 10th Symphony is one of the great works of all time. The Ninth Symphony, again, returns to this world of pointed irony and almost poking at the Soviet government, which gave him so much grief over the course of his lifetime. And then you have the late symphonies, the 11th, 12th, 13th, 14th, and 15th, which are all extraordinary works in their own rights. An amazing output over the course of a lifetime that was not easy, extremely sad. He lost so many people he loved, both to disease, death, famine, and then to Soviet purges. He always lived looking behind him because someone might be ready to point the finger once again at him. It's hard to imagine what it would be like to be an artist during those times, when, writing the wrong poem or the wrong play or the wrong piece of music could end up in being exiled to Siberia, or even worse, being executed. But this is the world under which these unbelievable artists lived and worked. And some of them managed to create pieces of unbelievable glory and I hope you'll agree that this is one of those. At any rate, I hope you will come join us at the concerts, January 27th and 28th at the Performing Arts Center at Greenwich High School. We feature violinist Maya Buchanan, a 21-year-old phenom out of Philadelphia, playing the Beethoven Violin Concerto. And we also have the Unanswered Question by Charles Ives and Shostakovich's First Symphony. Hope to see you there. Thanks for spending this time with me.